And we are live. Welcome back to another episode of The Rational Standard. My name is Martin van Staden. I am presently joined by David Ansara and Dr. Morné Malan, and we're still waiting for straggler Zakhele Mthembu. I'm sure he will be with us in a moment. But yeah, I mean, this has been an extremely eventful week, not just in South Africa, but in the world. The maybe the third or the fourth in a series of eventful weeks. But I guess the big thing on our minds right now is the U.S. cutting foreign aid temporarily, it is said, to review some of the ties that they have to some of these international organizations. And South Africa is, you could say, a beneficiary of this or a victim of this, depending how you feel about responsibility. But Aaron Motsoaledi is confused, as he always is. So, yeah, I mean, let's jump into it, gentlemen. I mean, we're a bunch of liberals and libertarians here. I don't think any of us have an uncritical view of foreign aid, but yeah, I'd love to get your senses of what's happening, whether this is a good move, is it a bad move, are we throwing the poor, or is Trump throwing the poor under the bus, or is this an opportunity for us to take some responsibility for our own initiatives?
Yeah, look, I mean, say what you will about Donald Trump, but ultimately he's been very clear. It's America first, and he's going to put the interests of the United States before other considerations. And I think if you look at the PEPFAR support that we've gotten over many, many decades now, that's been critical in terms of helping to mitigate the worst effects of the HIV/AIDS pandemic. But the question is that actually in America's interests? I think a lot of their foreign funding is going to go towards supporting military and strategic objectives rather than public health concerns. And simultaneously, the US is withdrawing from the WHO as well, the World Health Organization. So, and ultimately, yeah, Martin likes that. I mean, ultimately, if we want to solve these big problems, how's it, Zakes? We're going to have to fund them ourselves. And it's very interesting to me that a lot of people on the political left in the South African commentariat who love to bash the United States at every conceivable opportunity are now bleating and saying, oh, this is so sad that, I mean, obviously there's going to be lives at stake, which is a serious thing. But now they're wanting the US to come to the support of South African citizens, and Big Daddy must deliver. So I would say instead of the South African government indulging in fantasies like NHI and sending lots of money and personnel over to Cuba and other communist crackpot countries, they should be looking to put the interests of our citizens first and supporting these initiatives themselves.
Yeah, I think for me, a lot of what David's already said, it is fairly hypocritical for everyone to be so negative towards the US and negative towards Trump in particular when they at the same time feel that we're completely beholden to them. So we want to hear from you when it's about funding, but other than that, please stay out of our business on anything else and don't ever dare criticize anything we do. We just want your money. We don't expect you to actually get anything out of that, which is sort of a South African government staple in terms of the way they treat both taxpayers and international relations. So maybe that's just a sort of an ingrained ANC sort of value. But I think at a more fundamental level, there's also the case that, yes, on the one hand, Trump has said he's going to put America first, and it might be to the benefit of the US to withdraw this funding. I think a lot of times this funding is motivated by US interests in any case. I think it is sort of their own way of developing or at least entrenching their own values within other countries. It's sometimes negatively, sometimes positively, but it is a way for them to almost invade a different country, another country's culture. So not necessarily positive for the US, just because the influence that they have through that kind of funding is often worth more than any particular practical outcome. And then, regarding the actual recipients of the aid, it's also not always clear to me that it's to their benefit. There has been quite a bit of studies done on the value of these sorts of, well, I think you can call them handouts, the value of these handouts to countries, and often, particularly in developing countries, it inhibits the actual functioning of that country itself. They become completely reliant on the external funding, and whereas it's something that we probably could have done on our own. And it's not like, there's not enough money in the government budget. They spend, 2 trillion rand every year, and this isn't a huge figure. I don't actually know what the exact number is, particularly for the ARVs, but it's not a massive number in the bigger context of the budget. But if you're used to getting something for free, then having to pay anything at all suddenly feels extremely expensive. So I'm not entirely sure that them withdrawing funds is a positive for them, and I'm not entirely sure that it's a negative for us. I think they might have done themselves more damage, and might, at least theoretically, have done us a favor, provided that we actually do pick up the slack, as opposed to just sitting back and moaning, which unfortunately I think is the most likely of outcomes in this case.
Zakes, any views on Trump? I see you joined us a little bit later there, but we're just talking about this temporary funding freeze for a lot of foreign aid programs, both social, medical, and even military, but only through the U.S. State Department. So U.S. Defense Department foreign aid continues, but the U.S. State Department that's involved in kind of more medicinal and social and so on foreign aid, that's all been frozen for 90 days. I think the Marco Rubio, who's the new Secretary of State, he has walked back a little bit of it for more emergency kind of aid and so on. That's now being walked back, but it seems like the greater bulk of that funding has still been frozen. Any views on that, Jakes?
Yeah. I mean, I think I would agree more with what Morné said. I don't necessarily think it is a positive for them, and I don't think it is necessarily a negative for us, right? Of course, the perception is that, when funding stops, all of these organizations that are reliant on that funding will suffer, and, by an extension, the people who also rely on the services of those organizations. But as really pretty much echoing what Morné said, the whole point of aid, right? I'm a huge fan of this Indian economist called Deepak Lal, who really gets into not only developmental economics, but foreign aid in like third world countries and how it affects like the economies there. And Morné is pretty much right? When a government has another source of funding for something, the money that they would have spent on that does not magically stay there, right? It just gets spent on something else that the government wants to spend on. And now when that funding gets, retracted, of course there will be problems. And that is unfortunate in the short term, right? But and this is what, as a tangent, what drew me to the Austrian trade theory cycle is that the idea that things can become worse and then become better, right? Become worse to become better. So I guess in that instance, immediately, of course, it will be bad. But I think in the long term, right, if people do not moan about it, it will build capacity, particularly in African countries who, in South Africa, the funding was meant to capacitate us to be able to, develop the ability to manufacture the medicine and provide it ourselves. And really, we just use the funding as another source of, revenue for the state instead of, looking long term. So I think that will realign a lot of, leaders' what is the priorities in terms of what they should be spending their tax revenue on. And one of the few good things I think it is good for American taxpayers. The idea that as a taxpayer you should be giving money away to other countries is absurd to me. So I think politically it may be great for Trump. But as Morné said, in terms of the sphere of influence that America, projects and using these things, that will of course decrease, right? And that will give an opportunity for other countries that do have the capacity, like China, to then enter the space and pretty much play the role that America played in shaping the policy of certain countries that are reliant on aid from them. So it depends on how you look at it, but from an American taxpayer perspective, hopefully it results in less taxes paid. That's what I'm most interested in. But yeah.
Yeah, Sykes is right that money is fungible, right? So particularly for some of the beneficiary countries, South Africa is a democratic state, but you're actively covertly funding sometimes authoritarian practices. Like if you look at Bill Easterly, I think he's an NYU economist, he wrote a book about how aid actually props up authoritarian regimes. Like one of the classic examples of this was Meles Zenawi in Ethiopia, which was a recipient of vast amounts of aid, and they used that fiscal space to actually clamp down on civil liberties and shut down opposition groups and wage wars and so on. So, there's always these second order effects, the unintended consequences.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I kind of picked up on when I was preparing for this was that, so a lot of this funding is for NGOs, so it's not just government to government funding, but there is government to government funding. I think that's in South Africa maybe not the case, but one of the beneficiaries, for instance, is Myanmar. In Southeast Asia, where the US, according to its own foreign policy, says that there's a genocide being perpetrated there. I don't want to get into is there or isn't there a genocide, but the US says that there's a genocide. And yet the Myanmar Ministry of Health is a huge recipient, apparently, of this aid. So what you said there, David, I mean, that's obviously true. So now you have this foreign source of money coming into your healthcare that now you can spend this money on something that the guy who's sending you the money says is a genocide. So, I mean, there's a lot of perversion here, and that's kind of what I think we as liberals and libertarians tend to kind of get into, is to say, listen, you can have this nice idea, build the roads, fund AIDS, combating the AIDS pandemic, but ultimately it all becomes some kind of rent-seeking, perverted phenomenon, just because you have this coercive extraction of money. Then you have a political determination that has nothing to do with kind of the market-based resource allocation mechanisms that are tried and tested. So there's a lot of kind of rent-seeking perversions here that actually could fund genocide. But yeah, I mean, the other aspect of this is that the people kind of complaining about it, they're like saying this is now inconsistent with what has been the historical approach with American foreign aid, which has been to place need above politics. And I find that to be so funny. It's that rather than thanking the Americans, and I mean, I don't think the Americans should be thanked for foreign aid. I'm certainly more inclined to the thinking that Zakes has here, is that this is actually not a good thing for taxpayers. I think Zakes and I will disagree on whether that applies to military foreign aid, which I think I'm very, very much in favor of. But when it comes to stuff like welfare and these things that should be social and communal and so on, responsibilities, the rest of the world was very happy to take the money because, the Americans put need above politics. Thank you. So politically, we can criticize them relentlessly and we can take tangible steps against them politically, but thank goodness they put need above politics, so we'll take the goodies. So yeah, I think this is to an extent fuck around and find out to some of these countries. I think that there are real victims that are probably being created by this, but to a lot of them, I think this is just, well, this is reality. If you do not align your politics with the interests of the person who is funding you, in normal circumstances, you will be that funding will be cut off. So now maybe the US is aligning what was probably a very weird policy decision about we look at need rather than politics, with actually politics is not something you can just cleanly cut off from other things, and that it's actually quite transcendent. But on the other hand, Donald Trump, as the way he's kind of negotiated, is like he makes a big threat and maybe he cuts something off, but then it's just his way of saying, okay, let's let's chat about it, let's talk about it. So it's not now that the days of aid is over. Rather, it's the US is saying, listen, you have to change your ways, and then maybe the goodies can start flowing again. Morné, what I think you have a
I think we should probably just make just 2 points just to clarify, because I don't think we've quite made it clear to the viewers yet. It's not as though the aid has been summarily cut off. It's just a pause, and basically to audit basically where are these funds going, because there were quite a few scenarios in which, or there were quite a few situations where it was quite clear that the money was not being spent well. So yes, on the one hand, it is maybe emphasizing politics more than it had in the past, but on the other hand, it's also assessing whether, what need is this actually addressing. So it's not a complete ignoring of the need. It's just determining what is it that we're actually spending money on, and how are these funds actually being allocated. Just on Zakhe's point earlier, just like how they found that these types of foreign aid contributions are often negative, have a negative impact on the recipient countries. That's actually only true when it's funneled through these sorts of programs. They've also done studies where there is aid being provided to countries or to communities, and that aid is in the form of actual funding to individuals and families. And in those cases, it actually has an enormously positive impact. So you could theoretically
direct giving, basically.
Yeah, basically, it's a direct giving, except, well, I suppose it's a redistribution almost from the US to Africa or to developing countries, which is not necessarily the best thing if you're a United States citizen. But if you are going to be spending money in any case, you might as well be asking what's the most effective way to be spending that money. And I think at this stage, the literature is fairly clear on the fact that giving money directly to individuals is by far that's the greatest economic impact, particularly when it's currently going towards programs which we could easily be funding ourselves. And I think it just goes back to the almost the foundational issue in South Africa, and that's that we have an economy that's not growing. And until we solve that, none of the other issues will really be able to be solved, because just like giving money to these organizations as opposed to individuals, just like how that robs them of a certain degree of agency, so also this whole reliance upon foreign aid on the part of whether it's NGOs or whether it's government departments, that also robs us of a bit of agency, which is a weird thing. That's almost a kind of a left-right, far left, far right agreement on the spectrum, which is that it's only the US that has agency, and everybody else is just basically reacting to the US or accepting what the US has done, but nobody has any intrinsic motivations or anything other than whatever the US has done to them or for them.
David, I just want to pick up on that. Yeah, so I've spent a bit of time at US universities, and whatever building you go into, you'll see a huge wall covered with the names of the donors who have sponsored the production of the building. So there's a big culture of giving in the US, and it's private giving. So I think the quibble that we have is, okay, well, the coercive power of the US federal government is being used to take taxpayer money and then direct it towards these beneficiary countries. And I don't think we should be naive to think that there isn't an ulterior motive often with that donor funding, that it's designed as a form of soft power to project America's interests. But I think obviously there will be cuts, but I also wouldn't be surprised if you see the Trump administration using aid as a bargaining chip in the same way that they're using tariffs. These would be carrots rather than the sticks of withdrawing tariffs. So I don't think that all international donor funding is just going to disappear, but you might actually see it being channeled in different ways. So look out for that as well as a potential development.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Just really to, well, I guess a reflection, right? It's unfortunate, as Morné said, it is a temporary freeze in the funding. Ideally, in an ideal world, we want US taxpayers to not fund anything, militaries included, Martin, and foreign militaries included. So we want the US taxpayer to keep as much of their money as is possible, because as David noted, right, the United States is quite peculiar in that it is one of the richest countries in the world, yet it has a very rich philanthropic culture, right? So much so that it is pretty much considered the norm that when you reach a certain point, you must at least give away some part of it, right? And this is coming from a culture that idolizes really like the accumulation of capital and this creation. So to have that within a culture of, to have philanthropy within a culture like that of capital accumulation is something to be commended. So really, I find it unfortunate that it will be temporary. I really think that the conversation, the idea that we have normalized like international trade, U.S. citizens, right, who struggle, who have like their own internal domestic problems. I find their politics to be weird. That they pretty much normalize this projection of soft power, which is true, right? Their government does this for its own benefits, for its own interests. But I think that money could be better spent at home in America. I think there are, I'm sure if you can ask American bureaucrats, they will tell you a million ideas of how they can spend that money, right? Instead of giving it away to other foreign bureaucrats. So that is unfortunate. That is quite unfortunate. And I hope at the very least on the point of agency that Morné said, right? Like all these countries have the agency. A country like South Africa, for instance, has the agency of either taking US funding or not. But as Martin mentioned, a large part of it goes to these non-governmental organizations. So I don't think really it is advisable that the government should, if we were to have a beef with the US state, to say, no funding from the US government is supposed to come through, even though we do know that this funding, right, it is given to these organizations that align with American foreign policy interests and something like that. So I hope that for me in the third world, my country takes this as a lesson, right? We take this as a lesson to not be reliant on that's true, nothing is a spam as a temporary government program. That's Milton Friedman, wrong in many instances, like in monetary policy, but right in that instance.
Does that count for the halting of government programs? Is it there's a temporary freeze also?
No, that's
only works in one way.
That's the exception that proves the rule. Right. So some good logical positivism right there. But yeah, man. But yeah. I think generally for American citizens, I hope it becomes permanent. It won't be, but yeah, really, I think the lesson really is for third world countries. This is a learning moment for everyone, but I doubt that they will take it seriously. Cool.
No, I mean that's the key thing. So the issue, I mean, I always circle back to this, and this is the issue of responsibility. If the third world doesn't take responsibility for the real issues that kind of confront the society, it would always be poor. I mean, even if U.S. aid were to be quadrupled and upped considerably to, in theory, cover all issues, then it would still not solve the problem. I mean, look at the U.S. itself. I read a few years ago that since Lyndon Johnson started the kind of the Great Society welfare programs, in theory, enough money has been poured into it to solve poverty in the U.S. Many times over, and yet you still have relative poverty in the United States, and that is, I mean, to me, that is just a very clear manifestation of the issue of responsibility. If you don't have communities creating sustainable institutions in those communities that deal with the poverty that might arise from time to time, or you don't create an economy that's strong enough to absorb any kind of people who lose their jobs and so on, then you can keep throwing money at the issue as handouts. And that I don't want to minimize that it actually does help a person in dire need in the moment, but it doesn't create any kind of sustainable kind of solution to that issue. And if that happens in the US itself, times that by 100 in the developing world, where Africa has been decolonized for the better part of a century now, that time should have been spent freeing markets, letting the mystified, but also the institution with the worst rap in Africa, the informal economy, letting it exist and letting it kind of grow into a formal economy rather than trying to impose these kind of luxurious Western developed regulations on an economy where they're just completely inappropriate, where the state is now automatically, like after colonialism, the state is already daddy, the state is already mommy, whereas the rest of the world had centuries of there is no state that helps us. We actually have to take responsibility and develop a culture of taking care of ourselves. But Africa is not being given that opportunity. Much of the rest of the developing world is not being given that opportunity to take responsibility. So yeah, I think even though it might cause short-term pain, and Morné is right, it's not like the days of US aid are over. This is a review, but hopefully out of that, you will see some probably countries that are not positively inclined to the US being cut off entirely, and the people in those countries saying, well, geez, we actually do have to take responsibility now. And that, of course, presumes that the Chinese and the Russians don't fill the gap. Luckily, I think the Russian economy can't bear doing that. The Chinese one might pose an issue. David, do you have any more views on this?
Yeah, I mean, China exercises its self-interest even more assertively than the United States. And I'm not aware of any philanthropic kinds of initiatives. A lot of it is debt diplomacy, building a port or some kind of infrastructure, and then indebting a lot of those countries, and then basically taking over that infrastructure and then using that to project Chinese power abroad. So it's a geopolitical play. So yeah, so I think South Africans who might think, oh, well, Daddy America is letting us down, let's go to Mommy China. I don't think that's going to be a winning strategy either. I would really echo your comment about self-sufficiency and developing your own capabilities. Yeah, that's it for me.
Yeah.
Morné, if you want to have anything to add?
Yeah, I think to me it just comes down to the fact that these sorts of programs, and actually I think that on the whole, I mean, you have to assess it on a case-by-case basis, but on the whole, I think that where those sort of infrastructure plays by the Chinese have actually borne some productive fruits, they're actually preferable to these pure, almost handout kind of programs. The fact is that, when it's just a handout or when it's just trying to relieve some sort of temporary pain or something like that, but it's not actually contributing productively, at least infrastructure helps to make an economy more productive. That just entrenches the dependence of the country and of the people of the country to that aid. And I think what we're trying to do is to get people to be less dependent, not only on their own government, but certainly on foreign governments. You don't want people to be entirely reliant upon aid from external aid or internal aid. And I think that you quoted Milton Friedman there. I think there's another quote that's don't give me aid, give me trade. And that's really how you actually help a lot of developing countries, is just by trading with them, by allowing them to create their own products, create their own goods, and to be able to trade with other countries to sell those goods. That's how you actually build wealth in any country, not just in developing countries. But these sorts of aid programs really don't make any long-term difference, and even the short-term impact can often be outweighed by the negatives which accompany them.
There's a great book on this called Dead Aid by Dambisa Moyo, who is a Zambian economist, and she really makes that point that trade is really the pathway to prosperity. It's about 15 years old now, but it's a really good little book just explaining some of the perils of aid dependency.
Yeah, and I guess, Africa is really a troubled child when it comes to this, because it has almost an allergy to trading with itself. we were well connected on the African continent with some liberals and libertarians and free marketeers there. And the stories that we always hear from them is that if you just want to drive a truck full of goods from South Africa through Africa to some other African state to deliver goods, you are not just going through border checkpoints where you have to pay customs every single time, but you have to pay bribes. Like inside every single country, you have to bribe the police repeatedly, and that's why that's a big part of why Africa just isn't trading internally, not to any large degree. And it's so unfortunate. I mean, you see these YouTube content creators have these videos where they show the geography of, like, we don't have the Mississippi River that connects the whole continent like the US does, that kind of enables them to prosper. And they say, well, Africa is just screwed because it doesn't have these geographic kind of benefits. But I mean, trade overrules all of that. Ultimately, trade overrules all of that. Policy overrules all of that. You can have the worst geography in the world, like Hong Kong, like Monaco. You just don't have land. You just don't have resources. If you just decide to trade openly, you don't care about the import-export deficit. Like, they import everything. They have 100% deficit. Like, if you ask protectionists, they will say this is a complete disaster. But these people are some of the most prosperous people anywhere in the world because they have a pro-freedom mindset relative, and they have trade, and they have above all maybe a welcoming policy environment. These are usually tax havens. They say, listen, if you want to keep most of the money that you make, come and incorporate here. We're not going to punish you for success. So ultimately, it comes down to mentality. And Africa, we have a ways to go to get, really literally, just to get that mentality right. And then kind of the whole world opens up to us as far as possibilities go.
Do you guys remember Mpiaki Dlamini's presentation from the Libertarian seminar that we all attended?
Yes.
Where he was promoting the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. Do you think that that's a positive development? Like, I think his argument was that libertarians should be getting behind this.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, I think...
Zach, what's your view on that?
Yeah, I think it is generally a positive development, right? The African Free Trade Agreement is pretty interesting because it is contingent on a whole lot of players. Well, currently the two biggest supporters of the Free Trade Agreement are kind of in a skirmish, right, between one another in Rwanda and South Africa. So now that makes the prospects of it just even that much more dimmer. So but it is definitely something good, because I think what Martin, touched on the inability to just drive through Africa, the bribes are horrible, of course, but the bureaucracy. Africa has a whole lot of jurisdictions, and the bureaucracy of just traveling through Southern Africa alone with goods, and Southern Africa is pretty much interconnected already with the Southern African Customs Union, but that still creates a bit of problems. So I think the African Free Trade Agreement is going to be a good stepping block, right? Like, just in South Africa, we already have SACU. So I think we just need to improve really on, infrastructure, for instance, like, connecting the eastern parts of the country with, like, the western parts like Namibia and all of that. Just pretty much coordination. That's what we need, infrastructure. Whereas other parts of Africa still don't have that. East Africa is trying to have that. ECOWAS is also trying to have that. But I guess with the coups, that is going to be delayed because now you have to deal with a different government. But I think what, the European common market showed something very important, right? I think the US federal system, right? The US having a bunch of states just falling under one jurisdiction really was the first proof of concept that, like, just like try and have free trade within a geographical area as much as you possibly can. And, the European common market was further proof of concept to show, like, no, this actually works, right? It just allow people to be free, allow goods to move. And now currently I'm weirdly into Brexit videos, and I'm looking at the results of Brexit, and it's not good, right? Well, at the very least, their inability to access the European market has actually created more compliance costs for their entrepreneurs, and the whole point was to lessen the compliance costs and free up trade. So I definitely, AFTA is a good thing. I think it's a good thing. It should be supported. It's just that the nature of African politics, as I've mentioned, means that it most likely will not be. And I think as libertarians, it is the closest thing we'll ever get to like this free trade idea that we all want for the African continent. So
What's quite amusing about it, I find, is that it's all being driven by these African nationalist political leaders, and it's actually seen as like asserting African sovereignty, and whereas in the past that kind of language was used to drive the socialist agenda. So, I'm not complaining if that's used to advance more free trade and openness. But I think Martin's point earlier was actually there are a lot of non-tariff barriers. Like you'll just get officials lurking at the borders, extracting bribes and just making up nonsense rules like, oh no, you can't import this many eggs, you have to give me 20 of your eggs just to carry it across the border. And you hear these anecdotes of, because there are a lot of South African retailers in countries like Zambia and elsewhere, and their truck drivers have to drive with like a wad of paperwork like that just to cross the border, just to prove their credentials. So I think a lot more of that political will needs to be focused on removing some of those barriers. And Martin at that conference, he asked Mpiaki quite a good question, I thought, which is that a lot of these African countries are actually very reliant on import duties as a source of revenue collection. So that's going to be hitting at their interests quite strongly. And I think that's potentially a problem.
Mm-hmm. That's true. Well, just one last point, and I agree with you, Paul. Like David, really, the non-tariff barriers are the biggest, stumbling block, as Martin mentioned. But I think that once there's a mechanism that encourages, not only common trade, common interests. If you look at the EU, you have certain countries that are more powerful that can pretty much dictate terms to other countries, not directly, but influence them in a sense. And this is where South Africa can really, well, now it's not looking as likely, but this is where South Africa can really influence these countries, because I think if we support something like the African Free Trade Agreement, then it already has a mechanism like a court, and then we can start pushing for actual internal domestic policy, right? Having a mechanism that can review security policy or general security compliance or anything along those lines. But I think that once there's an existing mechanism, then the most powerful countries can really call for more order, because really that is a problem, right? I have family members who recently went to Mozambique, and they said that they had to actually hide the fact that they were South African, because when they were telling police officers that they were South Africans, the police officers wanted bribes from them each and every time. And these are just normal tourists, right, who are just driving from northern KZN to Mozambique. So that is definitely a problem. It is definitely a big problem.
Here's a question for you guys. Is South Africa a powerful country in the African continent? Militarily and economically?
Yes, certainly we are. I don't think we're a very popular country. I think we probably could be exercising a lot more power. I think we have a lot more power than we actually are exercising, just because we have such a bad reputation in the rest of Africa. And I think to me it almost comes down to two things. And the one thing is just that, unfortunately, there's this institutional issue, which, I mean, one shouldn't paint with too broad a brush, but there is this almost institutional issue in Africa where you have these extractive institutions. You have institutions that exist to extract wealth, or to extract, to get their piece of the pie that's just entered into their country. And I mean, that you have to change that mindset. You have to go from more extractive notion, the zero-sum idea that either we're winning or we're losing, and if the other guys are winning, that means we must be losing, to a more collaborative mindset. We have to really entrench the idea that what's good for country A can also be, and often also is, good for country B. And that's the one thing. And the other thing is just that I know it's going to sound terrible, but it all basically comes down to transaction costs. And I know when you think of transaction costs, the first thing you think of is something like tariffs and import duties and those sorts of things, but those are quite often not nearly as damaging as those non-tariff barriers, and the unpredictability of those non-tariff barriers to trade. Because if there's a 20% import duty, but you as a trader know that it's my truck or my ship will get there. This is what it's going to cost. I know it's going to go from the shipyard to the warehouse, and it's going to arrive there. If you have that reliability, I mean, that's a cost that you can reckon into your accounting. But when there's so much uncertainty, when there's so much risk, you have no idea what level of bribe you're going to have to pay, whether, regardless of the fact that you're paying the bribe, that your goods are going to arrive there, whether you'll get your money once your goods have arrived there. All those sorts of things make doing business more risky, and all those sorts of things they're all related to this extractive institutional kind of idea in Africa, which hopefully can start to break down, if not universally, then hopefully at least within the continent itself, we can start to develop this sense that we're here. It benefits all of us when some of us are being benefited, and you have to take that larger look and that broader perspective, which we certainly haven't been very good at doing up until this point.
Yeah, I guess to me it comes back to the idea that you have to allow Africa to experience the pain of not being plugged into some guaranteed foreign handout, so that it can learn these lessons. I mean, it was last year, I read something from Kenya where Starlink was just being set up, and the president had signed off on this being allowed there. It's Kenya or Tanzania. It's one of the East African states. And in his press release, or in his interview with the local press there, he says that this well-known CEO of the local cell phone company, it's a private company, but it's the biggest one in that country. He says, this guy, names him by name. He called me and he said, you can't allow Starlink. They're gonna blast us out of the water. As far as competition is concerned, we can't compete with that. And the president is like, well, no, I told Jim or whoever that, we have to do it for the betterment of the country. And it's just like that. I mean, to me, that was such a great example of the mentality, the how far we still have to go to kind of get to a point where it's like, actually, you should say, no, there's more competition. I have to do better now, rather than I have to call my buddy, the president, to say, hey, we need protection. And I guess the problem here is that we had a moment in world history recently, from the 90s up to very recently, where nominally, at least in principle, everyone understood that actually free trade, competition, these are good things. These benefit everyone. And now that is being challenged. And I certainly blame the West for that, the culture wars in the West. But Africa is gonna take advantage of that very unfortunate mentality where actually, no, protection is good. Protectionism for local industries, that is good. And keeping not just foreign trade out, but keeping foreigners out, that is good. And that is now the nominal that is developing, which, I think it's going to be bad for the West, but the West has the capacity to absorb that badness, whereas for Africa, it's going to be a total disaster. And we walk into it already with this unfortunately rent-seeking mentality. I mean, African history is so full of good examples of communities taking care of issues, and that has just been suppressed and beaten to death by the Western state. And now the Western state has given the rent-seeking class in Africa this new get-out-of-jail-free card, almost, to say, we don't have to say that free trade is good anymore. You don't have to say that anymore. We don't have to say that immigration is good anymore. We can now say, and the West will endorse you, that immigration is a bad thing and that free trade is a bad thing. So I find that to be an extremely unfortunate turn of events. We spoke about our favorite executive orders last week from Donald Trump. I think the Trump administration is probably doing a lot of stuff that we agree with, but as far as America being the leader in kind of the international discourse and so on, I think what Trump and certainly the Democrats, I mean, they're no exception to this, are now making it normal to be against free trade, to be against open international competition is actually not a good thing, and it would be good if that can be kind of rolled back relatively soon.
Yeah, well, I agree with Martin fully. Martin, you make great points, right? Particularly about the rent-seeking nature, right? Like, man, politics in Africa has been quite sad in the sense that the state, the Westphalian state, has operated, as Morné said, in an extractive manner. So what happened is when people took over these states, I think a part of it was, hey, this is now our turn to extract as much as we can from, these people that we're supposed to govern. And that mentality really has never left. And it is quite unfortunate, right? So that is why you see the normalization of having, relationships between a state president and a businessman. Well, when that happens in the biggest country and the biggest economy in the world, right? Then how can little old Africa avoid that, right? So I get that, and it's unfortunate, as you said, because America was a great example in there, and that you could always point to them, right? You could be like, hey, but America is doing this. America allows, immigration, and it is still prosperous and it's still, rich. Great. Americans still love their country. But, with the change in there, with the cultural changes, it gives credence to a whole lot of arguments, particularly from African leaders who, by the way, still received quite a few American assistance, right, through this whole policy of politics, or a need over politics, that is, which I agree with you, Martin, is quite horrible. But yeah. And now, though, they get a whole lot of support because, if Donald Trump says immigration is bad, then immigration is bad. And South African politicians who are anti-immigration can be like, hey, man, like this thing has really a chance, right? And if Trump is saying that there are only two genders as a government position, for instance, right, all of these leaders who now put people in jail for choosing to, choose their own sexuality, whether you agree with it or not, right? But in Africa, we already have, jurisdictions that take away your liberty just because you chose to exercise your rights to, have relations of any kind with another human being. I find that to be, pretty sad, because now these nations will gain credence, will now gain support, right? At the very least, at the inhibition of people's liberty. So it is quite unfortunate. And I do agree, a cultural shift, particularly in Africa, is needed in how we look at the state. I think this is my primary motivation for why I do the work that I do. And, what motivated me to write the paper I did last year for the Georgia IT Society was that I wanted to communicate a foundational understanding of, this is how I want to understand first a human being, then how they relate with other human beings, and of course their community, and subsequently their own jurisdiction. So yeah, hopefully that comes about.
Yeah, if I could just add there, it's about 2016, I wrote an article. I actually can't remember what the arguments I made in it, but the title I thought was pretty clever, if I do say so myself, is that if American culture wars have international consequences, and I think that is something that, I mean, it's a difficult concept to communicate, because we can't tell Americans, actually, you have to stop doing whatever because maybe it affects us. I mean, these are people with their own interests, and they have to do their thing. But the gleefulness with which, for instance, the American evangelical movement, which I'm a Christian, I feel relatively strong about Christianity, but I still think kind of there are excesses to imposing your religion in politics. But just the American evangelicals, kind of, you can say, conservative Americans, they might think of themselves as these kind of radical, kind of pro-Christian people, but actually they're actually quite liberal when you compare them to Africa. And I find it very unfortunate when many of those pastors and certainly their political representatives say, oh, look, but Africa is this great Christian and kind of a religious conservative place, and we actually have to feed into this, when they don't realize that, listen, you as an American evangelical, you do not believe in chopping people up and killing them for being gay. You oppose gayness, but you do not believe in this kind of stuff. But you are feeding it in Africa. You are feeding a lot of the authoritarian, totalitarian sentiments here, and you actually think that you're doing a good thing. You don't realize what it is that you're doing, and this certainly applies to trade, of course, but certainly to a lot more of these social issues that you kind of say it into the ether, and you say, oh, good, the Africans are religiously conservative, and that's awesome, and then you kind of close that book, and then you don't actually see what happens there and how your endorsement is actually weaponized. Morné, I think you want something to say?
Yeah, I actually just I just want to stress test this theory a little bit, because not so much that I think it's necessarily wrong, but just because I wonder about, there seems to be a sort of asymmetry between these kind of things where we all automatically assume that every bad sort of cultural phenomenon in the US or let's basically say it's basically the US. Maybe in earlier times it would have been Britain or somewhere in Europe. But okay, let's say we all sort of instinctively accept that these cultural developments have a very clear and almost direct impact, but that's only ever with regard to negative cultural notions. I don't see, I mean, if there are some cultural movements that I'd like to see present in Africa more, and in South Africa in particular more, it's make Africa great again. I mean, it's why, what would the equivalent look like? I mean, you have we spoke about this last week as well, the idea that Trump doesn't really have much of an ideology beyond the fact that he'll do whatever he thinks will make the US win. And I mean, where's that in South Africa? Where's anybody just arguing for, what we should do? We should be being awesome. We should be building awesome things. We should be winning, across the world. We should be dominating in industries. Anything like it. What would make Africa great again look like? And why is that just nowhere present? What's the the African dream? Is this the American dream? Everybody goes to America to accomplish the American dream. What's the African dream? To me, that's one cultural phenomenon that's deeply entrenched in the US, for which we just have absolutely no equivalent in South Africa. There's no notion of this idea that let's go be the best. Let's go do something wonderful, and let's maybe even be a little bit cocky about it. We don't have to, but I mean, I think that could certainly be a worthwhile overcorrection, based on the fact that we just have these slumped shoulders kind of notion that we'll never do anything great. We'll just muddle along. We'll make things better. That's really the most positive people get, is it's really terrible now. Let's hope they get a little bit better. That's not a phenomenon from the US, certainly.
David?
Yeah, just if you look at a country like Nigeria, if you've ever been to Nigeria, the most amazing people, but no sensible Nigerian who is ambitious wants to stay in Nigeria. So Nigeria's greatest export is oil and people. And if you look in the United States, the Nigerian expat community has the highest ratio per capita of PhDs than any other immigrant group. These are highly capable, skilled people. So why aren't they feeling like their home country, where they would actually probably prefer to live, is not a place of opportunity? And that comes down to what Morné was saying about institutions, but also lack of freedom. The Naira is rapidly debasing. That's why Nigeria is one of the top 10 most... they're very interested in Bitcoin, so they're, in terms of Bitcoin adoption, they're in the top 10, even though there's so many regulatory restrictions against Bitcoin use in Nigeria. People yearn for freedom all across the world, and Africa is no exception.
Yeah, I guess I just want to add, Morné, on that. I think I agree with you. So we tend to focus on kind of the negatives, but yeah, the positives are there, and David touched on that. And that is kind of the ideas that international libertarians in the West have that just don't go anywhere. They often, in Africa, they actually go quite far. And Bitcoin is one example. The other example is this idea of, no one's going to tell me how to drive on the road. Yeah, it's like, you say that in Switzerland, good luck. In Africa, that's actually made practical. And yeah, I think that's good. But the issue with the American culture wars have international consequences, is that the rent-seeking case in Africa, in Asia, whatever, they're going to only look for those bad ideas that increase the power of the state. They're going to latch onto those. And yeah, I guess that's just... I agree completely with you that there are good ideas in the West that come and flower very beautifully in Africa, but there are the bad ones tend to be what the political case grabs onto and to force upon the rest of us. Zach?
Yeah. No, I really echo. Particularly, Morné makes a great point, right? I want the African dream. I have quite, a whole lot of thinking about that, possibly for another podcast episode, right? But that the good finds it very hard to translate. And I think Martin makes a great point in that the people who define discourse in a lot of cases in Africa are pro-state, right? These are people who think that the state should be, your parent, looking after your every need. So whenever ideas like the American dream, they make fun of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, right? Like leftists consistently make fun of that saying, but like they don't understand the power in the consciousness in having a culture that really thinks along those lines, because then it makes welfare detestable, and then it has downstream effects on your broader community. But in Africa, we aren't there quite as yet. And I hope that as Martin says, we have more beautiful pro-liberty positive ideas flowering, right, outside of necessity, because a lot of pro-liberty ideas that flower, prove my point that liberty is necessary. So in Africa, really, we do things for freedom, because anything else is just impossible, since life cannot be lived without liberty. So I now hope that, the things that are not necessarily out of necessity, like a cultural shift, a consciousness shift, those things follow. And I'm quite optimistic about that. I wouldn't write as much as I do and do the things that I do if I didn't think I can change the world.
No, absolutely. Yeah. Guys, if there's nothing else on this, I think just for this last half an hour, we should spend some time on something that I don't think I have terribly much insight on, and that is the other big story this week. Very contentious, kind of a matter of life and death for many South Africans, and this is the conflict in the Congo. Just to try and provide some context, there has been a conflict in the Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo, specifically on the border with the African Great Lakes region. There, Rwanda, Burundi, and Uganda. And there's a group there called the M23 movement. I think they're on paper striving for self-determination for their region. They are backed, and they're largely Tutsi ethnically. They're backed by the Tutsi regime in Rwanda. Whether that's a clandestine backing or a overt backing now, I'm not quite sure. Things are moving quite quickly. The Congo is part of the Southern African Development Community, and South Africa, along with Tanzania and Malawi, has deployed some people say a peacekeeping force, other people say an offensive force to back the DRC government in dislodging and ultimately destroying the M23 movement. So that involves South African troops in that region of the DRC, in the city of Goma, where the M23 movement this past week has taken that city from the peacekeeping or offensive force and from the DRC government, leading to the shooting deaths of, I think the number is 13 South African troops. Hell of a lot of moving parts here. Some people are saying we must withdraw. Other people are saying we have to commit more fully. Some people are saying our government is acting incompetently. Others are saying you're being unpatriotic and you're taking Paul Kagame's side. a very complicated story, I guess. Let's just see if the four of us can try and make a little bit of sense of this. Let's start with you, David, if you have any ideas around this. You're unaudible.
So sure. It's very complicated. I mean, I think the big obvious headline issue is Paul Kagame's missive against Cyril Ramaphosa. And I mean, I think I was alluding to it earlier when I was asking that open question about, like, is South Africa still seen as a powerful actor in the continent? And I think, I mean, we libertarians often debate about how big the state should be, and we want it to be as small as possible. But military power is a big part of how you exercise your sovereignty and how you protect the rights of your citizens. But it just seems to me that the SANDF is badly undercapacitated and also is involved in a highly complicated conflict that it perhaps doesn't necessarily understand, and it's not clear what the best strategic outcome is. I mean, I guess a sidebar issue is, if you just look on the map of the DRC and consider that there's this huge impenetrable jungle, here be dragons in the middle, separating eastern from western Congo, and you have the political elite Tshisekedi in Kinshasa, and these events happening thousands of kilometers away. I mean, it seems to me that South Africa actually suffers from, or sub-Saharan Africa suffers from having these enormous states. I mean, Ethiopia is another example, that are actually quite plural, and there's a good case to be made for having a breaking up of some of these nation states. But obviously, these political elites don't want to see that. And that comes sometimes with volatility and violence, like we saw in South Sudan when it seceded from Sudan. So, look, I'm very hesitant to make any kind of confident proclamations about this very complex conflict. But it does seem to me that maybe there's a case for an Eastern DRC that has its own interests and is not beholden to a corrupt political class in Kinshasa.
Morné, any thoughts on this conflict?
Yeah, I suppose the question of the internal politics and whether or not there really is an issue with heterogeneity such that it's not really feasible to keep the country together. That's one thing. I think whether or not it's worthwhile for South Africa, or it's even desirable for South Africa to be involved in that, I think that's a different question, and it's not really one for which I have a good answer at the moment. I just think that in general, maybe globally, but even us as South Africans, we tend to ignore the plight of many of our fellow African citizens in our fellow African countries. I'm just for no other reason, but I just happened to be reminded while David was speaking of do you all remember the Bring Back Our Girls, Boko Haram? Does anyone know whether those girls were brought back? They were not. Spoiler alert.
Some escaped. I actually try to follow a whole lot of jihadist movement on the continent, but some escaped. I think one escaped and did an interview, but really the Nigerian military finds it extremely difficult to deal with Boko Haram, primarily because Boko Haram is funded externally, same as M23. But you can continue.
I'd love to see Zex's browser history. It would be a mix of Brexit videos and Islamist jihad in Africa.
That's true.
Morné, maybe Zex, you want to give us your take on what's going on?
I think as everyone said, it is quite a complicated conflict. It is quite complicated. On David's point, right, on the case for an Eastern DRC, I get the case of it because there's a large Tutsi population, right, and while simultaneously in the Eastern DRC, there's also a non-Tutsi population that is also pretty large, right? In South Africa, the primary reason we're involved in this is because we have a large contingent, right, of Congolese immigrants in South Africa. And, if you've managed to talk to any Congolese immigrant, from just a personal anecdotal experience, right, you get a very different view of Paul Kagame and Rwanda and the general conflict in Congo. Firstly, the current state is corrupt. I think that can be clear, right? The current Congolese government is corrupt in that it is really not the most, I would say, ethical when it comes to dealing particularly with issues in the Eastern DRC, right? The reason there's a rebel movement there is because the people there have genuine concerns, right? The Tutsi people there have genuine concerns. So while simultaneously, I think that the conflict is a meeting of South Africa has been a power in Africa in general, and particularly Southern Africa for a pretty long time. And Rwanda is a burgeoning power in East Africa, at least militaristically. And if you look at its alliances, it is allied with, the United States and I think with, Israel. So those are militaristically the best allies you could really have. And then if you look at the history of Paul Kagame and his insistence, he's a Tutsi nationalist. If you look at actually the reports that were done into the Rwandan genocide, you would find that Paul Kagame, the Tutsis were the only organized force when you contrast it, right, to the Hutu national government. Instead, what precipitated the genocide was a Tutsi attack on the Hutu president. The entire thing is that it is not as clear-cut as the Tutsis in Eastern DRC want independence, because there are people who aren't Tutsi in DRC who do not want to be part of a Tutsi-led, jurisdiction. And then in terms of militaristically, it would be very difficult, right, to make a pronouncement, as someone has already said. I was watching a defense expert saying that South Africa should withdraw because, there's no strategic benefits really to continuing the fight. And I don't necessarily know how I feel about that, because Paul Kagame, right, his utterances, which goes back to, David's point about whether South Africa is still powerful or not. His utterances were not the utterances of someone who is just going to let this slide. And I don't think that us withdrawing is the end of this. Particularly, I am, I have a conspiracy hat on, right? If Paul Kagame is allied with Israel, Israel has Mossad, and Mossad is the best at asymmetric warfare. Well, the best agency that we've seen in the history of the world, really, at asymmetric warfare. And if you remember, we took the Israeli state to the ICJ, and I don't think they are particularly happy about that. So maybe through some form, right, this thing does not end, and Paul Kagame has a bone to pick with us, and for that reason, right, I don't think we should withdraw. This is me personally, but of course it's easy for me to say this because I'm not in the army, I'm not in the military, I'm sitting here in the comfort of my home, right? But since we've suffered losses at the hands of the Rwandan government, it should be clear, really, M23 is supported by the Rwandan government. And we've suffered losses. South Africans have died at the hands of the Rwandan government. That even though everyone is trying to avoid it as an act of war, it's a declaration of war. The comments that Paul Kagame made following that are a further cementing that pretty much what are you gonna do about it? That is that he did the South African state. We killed them. What are you gonna do about it? And I don't think withdrawal is the best projection of power. And most importantly, I don't think that it'll benefit our security threats in the long term, because Rwanda, if the Rwandan government is capable of assassinating someone in South Africa in a Senton hotel, right, as they accused Paul Kagame of doing to his political rival, then I think that the threat is not going away. In Mozambique already, the Rwandan Defense Force is there, and Mozambique is much more closer to home. And as I said, I follow jihadist movement. There is a burgeoning jihadist movement in northern Mozambique, in Cabo Delgado, trying to take control of the natural gas and oil fields that were discovered offshore there. So I don't think the issue is going to go away. Instead, I think that it is only just beginning, and the South African state should make a stand, particularly in Congo. I don't think that the Rwandan government can give us that much of a problem, because even in the instances, right, they reported on South African losses, as you said, 13, but they didn't report on the rebels' losses, which were way more than the South African losses. So militaristically, I think we are quite capable, but that also will necessitate a change in how we look at funding for the SANDF, and even like temporarily, immediately, that will necessitate a whole lot of funds that will have to be released, maybe from an emergency contingency fund or something like that. But yeah, in terms of withdrawal, I wouldn't say I agree with withdrawal, because fellow South Africans have died, and pretty much Paul Kagame said, yeah, so what? So yeah, those are my thoughts. Either way, though, I don't think, I wouldn't make this is not a hill I'm willing to die on. If someone were to make an argument for withdrawal, maybe I'll consider it. But yeah, in terms of I don't think so. But yeah.
I guess one of the risks is that because our defense force is incapacitated, that we incur further losses, that we get bogged down in a conflict that we don't fully understand or can't really control the dynamics of. So yeah, if more body bags start coming back from the Eastern DRC, that could really, grow a lot of antagonism towards the conflict domestically.
Yeah, I guess I have. I don't want to come too far out of left field, but for me, it's. I think a part of it I agree with Zakes. I think a part of it I disagree with Zakes. I think on the one hand, South Africa cannot afford to keep. So we have this military, right? And we've deployed it only a handful of times since the border war ended. One of those times was in the Central African Republic, and almost immediately when we suffered losses there, Zuma withdrew the whole deployment, and now we've suffered losses. And it's obviously it's horrible, but 13 dead soldiers is not. That's not even a platoon. I mean, this is war. It cannot be that the second our military suffers any kind of losses, we withdraw. I mean, again, I think Zakes is completely right. It's very easy for us to say from the comfort of our own homes. However, the other side of this is that South Africa has a volunteer army, and that to me is that is the shining star on the hill. That is the principle at stake here, and that is that if you've signed up to join the army, you have done something very consciously, and that is you have committed to deploying wherever your commander-in-chief says you need to go, and you are willing to die. You are acknowledging the fact that you can die. Now, then it kind of comes out of the humanitarian realm of what about bring our boys back and so on. It's the same view that I often take on American foreign deployments when the American public says bring back our boys, and it's like, listen, conscription ended with the Vietnam War. These guys are not there against their will. Stop that. But obviously, it's understandable for families. I don't want to belittle the fact that people are dying. The other thing is, and this is where I think I disagree with Zakes, it's not clear to me that we need to be at war with Rwanda specifically, even though Rwandans have shot South African soldiers. I think that it's at least ambiguous what the South Africans are doing there. President Ramaphosa says it's a peacekeeping force. I went to SADC's website and I tried to understand what this thing is. And yes, they do use the word peace, but they also refer to the SADC agreement, which says that when there's a conflict, it's basically another version of Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, which says an attack of one of us requires a military response from all of us. Now, that is not just kind of a UN kind of, we're going in to kind of keep the hostiles separate. There is some indication that the SANDF with this force is there in an offensive capacity, which I'm not against that in principle. I think that if you decide to do that, then you do that. And that's kind of my next point. And that is one of the reasons Europe and North America are so prosperous is because war is basically illegal on those continents. If you try to make war in Europe, and Russia is obviously doing that, and there's been a big response to that. If you try to make war in North America, it's not allowed. In Africa, it is allowed. It is actually perfectly allowed in Africa to have these drawn out armed conflicts, and everyone's writing letters and are very upset about it. But actually, no one is coming in and saying, listen, we're not doing this. And I think that if anyone in Africa has to do that, it's South Africa. We are the only country really with an independent resource base that can fund a military. We are the only country with sure, Nigeria has some of this. I don't want to belittle that, but we have an arms industry in this country. We are a military power. We're not an awesome military power, not a great military power, but as far as Africa goes, we are a notable military power. If there is one country on the continent that has to ensure that conflict is not allowed on this continent, we are here to prosper, it must be South Africa. And I'm not just talking about Rwanda now. I'm talking about the Horn of Africa. It is absolutely insulting to me that we have American and French and Chinese destroyers policing the Horn of what? Of Africa. Are we that incapable as a continent of just keeping the trade route that just quickly kind of passes by our own continent? Are we that incapable of just keeping that open for the world? I mean, yes, it's an injunction on Africa, but on South Africa, we have this grand navy. Yes, our ships are out of order because we don't maintain them, but these are modern destroyers. We're the only African country, other than kind of some North African states, with a navy that can do this job, and we are not doing the job. We are outsourcing it to the West. Africa needs to be a safe place for freedom. It is not a safe place for freedom, and I don't think the state must always be the institution that makes a continent safe for freedom. But I think that in Africa's context, we do need a military push, at least from South Africa, to keep it safe. What does that mean for the DRC? I really don't know. I think it's problematic for us to be on either side here. Zakes spoke about the DRC government being hopelessly corrupt. David alluded to what I think should be obvious, and that is that King Leopold II's borders that he drew for his estate in Africa that ended up becoming the DRC should not be holy scripture to us, that this thing must just keep existing like this forever. I think at least enforce federalism on the DRC, at the very least, enforce federalism on the DRC. To say that you have to allow a lot of autonomy for these regions, and we're going to force you to allow it. We're not going to do this thing where Nigeria calls itself a federation, but actually it's not. Enforce federation, at least on the DRC. But yeah, it's unclear to me on whose side South Africa should be on, and I think that to me says that South Africa should be on its own side. It should be on Africa's side. It shouldn't choose, we're going to support the DRC regime or we're going to support Kagame. South Africa really, I think, should go in there and say, listen, we are Africa's superpower. We are now putting down our foot. It's a South African peacekeeping force, and we will shoot anyone who tries to disrupt the peace here, and that includes the DRC. Even if they appeal to sovereignty and whatever else they want to, we need call it the Monroe Doctrine in Africa. I think Unpacking has said quite a bit about this, and that is to say, listen, Boko Haram, Cabo Delgado, northern Mozambique, eastern DRC, the Sahel region, it's not allowed anymore. You don't get to make arbitrary war like this anymore, at least not without our permission, is more or less where my thinking around this goes. I know that's easier said than done, but I don't think Africa could ever be prosperous if war is just this thing that just can happen at any second, just kind of casually.
Yeah, to me, it basically comes down to that last point you made, Martin, which is that we have to act in our interest. So, I mean, at the end of the day, if the issue is, and I do think you have to separate quite a few things here. If the issue is that SANDF doesn't have the capacity, then that's an issue of capacity. It's not necessarily an argument against us getting involved. If the issue is that we have a lack of understanding, then we should create a better understanding. But fundamentally, we do have to know what our goals are, and we have to know what is in the interest of South Africa. We have to, and just saying that, maybe we should be involved, but we don't really know what outcome we want. That's how you get sort of completely swallowed up by these sorts of conflicts. Is nobody has a clear goal in mind. So you have to very clearly define, and that's something I haven't really seen on the part of our political class is just somebody explaining what it is that we want to happen there. We have to know, is it that we want the rebels to die? Then we should kill them. If we want the rebels to succeed, then we should help them. But the point is, we have to actually know, or is it in our benefit to have the conflict actually continue? But just have some sort of notion of what it is that we're trying to accomplish there and why it is that we're trying to accomplish it. Regarding the broader point, I do think that, I do think we are in a position where, it sort of goes back to David's question, whether or not we're actually the superpower. But I do think in terms of at least the military power in Africa, we certainly could be. Whether we are, I'm not sure at this moment. But I do think we're increasingly entering into a situation where somebody's going to take up the mantle. And from where I'm sitting, easy for me to say, I'd rather that be us. Given the fact that it's going to happen to somebody, or somebody's going to do it, I'd really rather that somebody be us. And then the last point is just that on the federation thing, yes, I mean, we are, you have to sort of be pro-federation. You have to be pro a devolution of power. Have the most important decisions be made by the lowest level of government. Give people as much sovereignty over their lives as possible. But I do think that it almost goes beyond that for me. I think it's almost become a sort of catch-all excuse for just about everything that happens in Africa. Is you have colonial borders and they don't really make sense. It's a lot like the arguments in the Middle East. Is it's such an artificial creation, and that's all true. But I think basically the core of most of these things are the resources are incredibly scarce, and when people feel that they're in a fight to survive, then that creates conflict. Instead of when there's a sense that the pie isn't growing, everybody gets really bent out of shape to get their piece of the pie, to secure their piece of the pie. I can't remember if it was on the pod or in person that David mentioned the fact that in Nigeria, I think they haven't had a census in over a decade, just because there's these allocations based on paid out to different ethnic groups in Nigeria, and every time that they say that the government says that they're going to do a census, the civil war basically breaks out because everybody's trying to protect their percentage of the pie that they're currently getting. And to obviously decrease the percentage of the pie that other ethnic groups are getting. So, yes, I do think that if we do have a clear objective, we should pursue it and not mix in other shortcomings with whether or not it's desirable for us to be there. But I also think that more at the kernel of the whole thing is actually you have this shrinking pie or this stagnating pie, and that's going to create a lot of conflict, whether that conflict's ethnic or whether that conflict's religious or whether whatever it may be. Could even be across borders in this case. But you're going to have to actually, and that's why I favor trade over war, but I favor clear decision making over anything else. Decide what it is that you want to accomplish, and then act accordingly, which is something that I just don't think we're doing at the moment.
Yeah, those are all great points. I mean, I guess the question is, does South Africa have power to project? And that is part of the strategic calculation. Is if you think of the United States, they have an enormous military power, and that factors into their decision making. It just seems like a lot of those soldiers have been very badly let down by poor decision making and resource misallocation. But I must say, I am very aware of the limits of my knowledge of this complex conflict. But I do know that Jacob Zuma actually was very instrumental in brokering peace in the Great Lakes region. Obviously, that was short-lived, but if you think of, in some ways, his experience in exile, very different to Cyril Ramaphosa's. He's very familiar and comfortable with navigating through the complex environments in other African countries. And yeah, I mean, the man has many shortcomings and failings, but he was able to understand the power dynamics in Africa, I think, more than any other South African president.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Zakes, I'll come to you now. I think the thing that we do agree on is that the SANDF is not what it could be. So, I mean, this comes up that are we a superpower? And I think me and Morné have said we could be. And I think that's the key thing. South Africa has the military infrastructure to make it the continental superpower at the very least. But if I have it correctly, the SANDF is one of the few kind of government institutions that has only had its budget cut. Like, that is consistently since, I think, the early 2000s, it has had its budget cut to fund the general state wage bill, to fund grants and so forth. And it kind of comes back to the point I alluded to earlier, where I think that kind of foreign aid in general is a problem, but military aid is different. There is, in the classical sense of understanding the state, a difference between, call it its core directive to ensure order and kind of peace, and the kind of more maternal and paternal role of controlling what people do and controlling how well they live and so on. And we have failed even as far as our police is concerned, we have failed completely on the basic order aspect. We failed on that domestically, and certainly we're failing to capacitate our soldiers to do that regionally and internationally. So I think, for me, a very basic bottom line is that we need to divert resources. I mean, obviously, I would rather we just cut taxes, and that goes back to South African businesses and taxpayers. But if we are to have a big government, we certainly have to cut nonsense like Department of Sports and Recreation and Department of Planning and whatever, and just the military has to actually be a thing that exists. And that, the big worry is Mozambique, terrorists very close to our borders, and we've deployed there, and it's mission complete. Yippee! George Bush on the aircraft carrier. It's great. It's like they're still there. What are we talking about? This mission complete nonsense? Yes, we were kicked out by Mozambique, but I would say we should say, actually, Mozambique, if you can't do it, we will do it. So show us rather than telling us. Zakes, maybe a short comment from you, and then we'll need to wrap it up.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with, particularly we could be a superpower, comment. I think is more true. It is a very weird position South Africa is in. It's like, we have the capacity, but do we? I mean, can we? But yeah, I think we definitely do have the capacity of being a superpower. I just think relatively, right, in comparison to, the current conflict between South Africa, even within our incapacitated state, I don't think the Rwandan military is that much of a problem if we were to, really engage with them, since they are the primary concern. But man, I was reading, an article about how they were even stressing about launching jets, right? And they were talking about the cost of jets and the cost of fuel. I was like, man, I miss, this is where you appreciate the Pentagon just having a blank check. Americans would never even think of the cost of fuel if one of their soldiers died in any part of the world, right? So yeah, I agree with you, Martin, in particular, that we need an increase in resources. This has been a huge indictment, particularly on our I want to say culture concerning where we allocate funding in South Africa. As you said, the defense force has been consistently getting cuts, right? We want these cuts to happen in the Department of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs, for instance. That should definitely not exist. But, these cuts don't happen there. They don't happen to the wage bill or to, the health sector or something like that. But they happen to what a lot of libertarians would consider a foundational, duty of the state, which is the protection of the liberty and property of its citizens. So yeah, this has been an indictment on the South African state states. And I agree with David. I think particularly on Cyril Ramaphosa, right? Whichever way you look at it, he does not come out of this looking good. He does not come out of it looking particularly great. So yeah, and looking forward into the actual objectives, right? Morné mentioned that we don't know what the South African state wants to achieve in Congo, right? I think really their objective is to support the current government. Their objective is to eliminate the rebels, I think, because it stopped being a peacekeeping, mission when they joined the side of the DRC government and were allied with them against M23 rebels. So their objective is to get rid of the rebels. That I think is the objective, to support the current Congolese government, which is unfortunate too, because the problems will persist. The Congolese government is the reason, as I said, rebels sprang up in the eastern part of the country, because the Tutsi people felt like they had their rights, trampled on. So that problem does not go away, I think, by the defeat of the M23 rebels. So we need really an all-encompassing, agenda, as Martin would say, whereby we're like, okay, cool, everyone listens to us, and it's either our way or the highway. Whether we'll have that and see that be a reality, well, is contingent on the response to this, right? So we have to see an increase in spending. That is my parting point. Hopefully, we see an increase in defense spending in the upcoming, I think, midterm budget speech. So, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think that was a good deep dive into some of the international and foreign issues that South Africa is very much involved in. On the one hand, we have Aaron Motsoaledi crying about the US cutting aid to us. On the other hand, we have a conflict in the DRC. Very interesting week. Actually, I don't see next week being any less interesting. The expropriation without compensation issue is still very hot in South Africa as we sit here right now. It was actually difficult for me to avoid getting into that again, but let's try and get some variety. But I'm sure you'll hear about EWC and this conflict and the US's maneuverings as well, again from us here on the Rational Standard. But thank you, everyone, for joining us live or for watching this in the future. We have been the Rational Standard team, Martin van Staden. I was joined by Dr. Morné Malan, David Ansara, and Zakhele Mthembu. And please remember to like, share, and subscribe to this channel and this video. And yeah, let us know what you think in the comments, and we might give you a shout out next time. Anyway,
do it or we'll slap 25% tariffs on you.
Absolutely.
And remove your aid funding.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. But all right, gentlemen, everyone, have a good one. Cheerio.
Cheers.
Cool. That's